He stood barefoot on the hot concrete at the exit from the dungeon and couldn't understand why the concrete was so warm. Then he remembered. The sun. The real sun, which he hadn't seen in 100 years. A black bone sword rested on his shoulder, and 2 young hunters were already reaching for their weapons. The air hit his face with its smells, exhaust fumes, roasted meat to the left, coffee. The coffee smells so strong that Dan's head is spinning. He squints against the light. A cloak made of demon hide hangs down to his knees in tattered strips. His bare feet are covered in scars enough to cover 10 people. Before him stand 2 girls in hunter uniforms, C rank, judging by the patches. Young, clean-faced. One has a tiny white earbud sticking out of her ear. Dan stares at that earbud and can't look away. 100 years have passed, and the earbuds are still tiny. The thought burns with laughter and horror at the same time, and he forgets how to breathe. One girl reaches for her radio. The other steps back and places her hand on the hilt of a short sword. Dan realizes he has to say something human. He opens his mouth. His tongue won't obey. For 100 years, he's spoken only to himself and to creatures that didn't understand words. Anon. His voice comes out hoarse, like stone against stone. His knees buckle. He falls onto the concrete and feels the heat seep through his skin into his bones. Real concrete, not the stone of the other side, not dust, not bones. One hunter is already shouting into a radio. Code 3, anomaly, a living object from a sealed dungeon. Somewhere, engines are humming. Someone is laughing. Music is playing from someone's phone. The world didn't stop while he was gone. 3 minutes later, 2 black SUVs with blue flashing lights pull up. 4 men in tactical vests jump out of the first one. A woman in a white lab coat gets out of the second. They surround Dan in a semicircle. One aims the system's scanner at him. The device beeps, then again. Then it goes off non-stop. The man looks at the screen and turns pale. In the level column, the word Max is lit up, and a red error icon is flashing. In the awakening rank column, the letter D is displayed. He whispers that the scanner must be broken. The woman in the lab coat crouches down next to him and asks his name. Dan opens his eyes. So Ji-hwan. Then he thinks and adds, Dan, my name is Dan. The woman freezes. She pulls out a tablet. She types in the name. A photo of a 22-year-old guy and his status pop up on the screen. Killed. B-rank dungeon. Incheon. 5 years ago. The face matches. Younger than he should be, but it matches. She asks how long he was inside. Dan counts. He loses count. He counts again. He loses count. After his 34th year, he stopped counting. But he kept living, and he kept killing whatever crawled out of the fog, every day, without sleeping more than 4 hours, without food except what you carve out of a demon's corpse. He says simply, about 100 years. The woman's hand holding the tablet trembles. They load him into the car. They give him water, real water, cold. Dan holds the bottle with both hands and drinks as slowly as he can. He's afraid he'll drink too fast and wake up, and there will be the stone again, and the fog, and silence. On the way, he stares out the window. Seoul has changed and hasn't changed. The same towers, the same screens, but there are more gates on the horizon. 3 violet flickers hang in the sky to the north. He hadn't seen more than one at a time before. One of them pulses erratically, as if it's breathing. Dan knows that breath. He's heard it for 100 years. That's how the other side breathes when it's hungry. At the hospital, they put him in a private room. Dan sits on the floor against the wall. He can't lie down. Lying down means being vulnerable. He learned that rule in his 3rd year when a creature came at night and nearly bit his leg off while he slept. Since then, he's slept sitting up, with his back to a rock, with a sword on his lap. A nurse sees him on the floor and asks why he isn't in bed. Dan looks at the bed. Too soft. It will swallow him up. The nurse doesn't understand. He doesn't explain. At night, he doesn't sleep. He listens to footsteps in the hallway, the hum of the lights, a distant phone ringing. He picks up the remote, presses the button. The screen comes to life. A woman in a suit says that in the past month, 3 B-rank dungeons haven't been cleared on time, that the association has raised the alert level, that the guilds are suffering losses. On the screen is a photo of a group of hunters, young faces. some are smiling. A caption at the bottom. Killed during a cleanup of an anomalous dungeon in Canham. Dan looks at their faces. In their early 20s, their whole lives ahead of them. He turns off the screen, looks at his hands, scars on every finger, every phalanx, every joint. The hands of a killer, the hands of a man who has been doing the same thing for 100 years, surviving. Now he has to learn something else, to live. In the morning, 4 people came into the ward, 2 in suits, 1 in a Hunters Association uniform, a woman with a tablet and a voice recorder. They sat down across from Dan, who was still sitting on the floor by the wall. A black bone sword lay on his lap. The man in the association uniform introduced himself as Senior Inspector Pak Donho. He said he needed to ask a few questions. Dan nodded. The first question was about the dungeon, how he got there. Dan replied that 5 years ago, according to Earth time, he had entered a B-rank dungeon as part of a raid group from the Whitestone Guild. He was D-rank, a disposable soldier, a porter, and a human shield. The floor collapsed. He fell into a pocket of the other side, a fold in space that the system cannot see. Inspector Park took notes. The second question was about time. Dan said he had spent about 100 years inside. Inspector Pak looked up from his notepad, then he looked back down. He wrote it down. The third question was about the level. Dan said he didn't know the exact number. The system had stopped displaying numbers after the window broke. That was around the 60th year. After that, an error message just kept flashing. The woman with the tablet asked how he had survived. Dan thought for a moment. He began to tell his story. The first 10 years were the hardest. Every day, a creature would emerge from the fog. At first, they were D-rank. He killed them with whatever was at hand, stones, bone fragments. Then the creatures grew stronger. C-rank, B-rank. He had to learn to forge. He found a spot in the desert where the rock was hard enough to serve as an anvil. He learned to strike bone against bone until a blade formed. He made his first real sword in his 4th year. It was crooked and dull, but it worked. By his 10th year, Dan was killing B-rank creatures in a single minute. By his 20th, he stopped timing his fights with A-rank creatures. By the time he was 30, he began to forget Korean. He started talking out loud to himself every day. He told himself how the day had gone, what he had eaten, what he had killed, what the weather was like in the desert. There was no weather, always gray fog and gray rock. But he described it as if the weather were changing, so his brain wouldn't forget that things could be different. By the time he was 40, he met someone. Dan fell silent. Inspector Park waited. The woman with the tablet waited. Dan said he wasn't ready to talk about it. Inspector Park nodded and moved on to the next question. They wanted to know about his equipment. Dan placed the sword on the floor in front of them. Black bone, 90 centimeters long. The blade was jagged, but not from where. Each notch had been carved intentionally. Dan explained that this bone came from a creature not found in any classification. He had killed it in the 73rd year. The bone doesn't dull, it doesn't rust. Upon impact, it cuts through an A-rank protective field like water. One of the men in suits reached for the sword. Dan covered the sword with his palm, calmly, no threat, just covered it. The man withdrew his hand. The interrogation lasted 4 hours. Then another 2 hours the next day, and 3 more on the 3rd. Between interrogations, Dan sat in the ward and looked out the window. Seoul went about its business. Cars, people, screens, the violet flickers of the gates on the horizon. 3 of them, sometimes 4. On the 2nd day, a nurse brought him a phone. She said it was a temporary one from the association. Dan took it. Slim, lightweight. The screen lit up at his touch. It took him 20 minutes to figure out how to unlock it. Then another hour to figure out the interface. Then he opened the browser and typed in his mother's name, So Mi Jong. The first link was to a social media page. He clicked. Photos. Dozens of photos. His mother against the backdrop of the sea. His mother with friends. His mother holding a cake. The date of the last photo, 7 years ago. Nothing after that. He scrolled down, found comments, candles, condolences, words about how wonderful she was. Dan sat on the floor of the ward and stared at his phone screen. His mother had died 7 years ago. He wasn't there. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't even know. For 100 years he had survived in a stone desert and never once thought that time passes on Earth too, that people grow old, that people get sick. that people die. He placed the phone on the floor, screen down, sat up straighter, closed his eyes. Inside there was emptiness, no pain, no anger, no grief. Just emptiness. And that emptiness frightened him more than any creature from the mist, because the creatures wanted to kill him, but the emptiness meant that a part of him had already died, there, in the desert, 100 years ago. On the third day, Inspector Pack arrived, alone, without an entourage. He sat down in a chair across from Dan and said that the association had made a decision. Dan was declared alive. His deceased status was revoked. He was assigned a Trimary Hunter's badge. His rank was undetermined until he passed a full evaluation. The evaluation was scheduled for tomorrow at the Silver Tiger Guild's main training ground. Dan asked why there specifically. Inspector Park explained that the association didn't have equipment capable of measuring stats above S rank, but the Silver Tiger had a training ground with A-class training golems. That's the best Korea has to offer. Dan nodded. Then he asked if they would give him shoes. Inspector Park looked at his bare feet, covered in scars, with calluses as thick as a finger. The feet of a man who had walked on stone for 100 years. Inspector Park said they would find him some shoes. The night before the test, Dan tried lying down on a bed for the first time, carefully, as if it might bite him. The mattress sagged beneath him, soft, warm, strange. He lay there for 4 minutes. Then he stood up and sat back down on the floor against the wall. He placed the sword on his knees. He closed his eyes. That was the right thing to do. That was safe. That was how he had slept for 100 years, and his body didn't want to forget. The Silver Tiger testing ground occupied an underground floor the size of a football field. The walls were covered with energy-absorbing runes. The ceiling was reinforced with a triple layer of A-rank protective barriers. Dan stood in the center of the hall in the clothes he'd been given: black pants, a black t-shirt, sneakers 2 sizes too big because his feet were wider than an average person's. 100 years of walking on stone. People stood on the balcony above the training ground, about 30 of them. Dan saw Inspector Park. Standing next to him was a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit, the head of the Silver Tiger Guild, Cha Min-ju. Dan knew this because during the interrogation, they had shown him photographs of the leadership of all the major guilds. Standing next to Minju was a girl, tall, straight back, black hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her face was as still as ice. She was wearing a white Silver Tiger Guild combat suit with a silver stripe on the sleeve, S rank. Dan didn't know her name, but he noticed that she was looking at him differently than the others. The others looked at him with curiosity, or with distrust, or with greed. She looked at him with something else, something he couldn't read. That didn't surprise him. He didn't know how to read people. He'd forgotten how. The instructor at the training ground stepped forward. He explained the rules. Dan would be given a government-issued D-rank, government-issued sword. He would be pitted against an A-class training golem. The task was simple: show what he could do. The instructor placed the sword in front of him. Standard, mass-produced. Steel mixed with mana. The hilt was wrapped in black tape. Dan picked up the sword. He turned it in his hand. He looked at the blade. He ran his finger along the edge. The metal trembled, barely noticeable, as if the sword were afraid. Dan understood why. The blade had been improperly tempered. The edge was too thin at the base and too thick at the tip. The balance was shifted toward the hilt by 3 degrees. Upon striking an A-rank golem, this sword would shatter in a 1.5 seconds. Dan looked at the instructor, then at the golem standing 20 meters ahead. A 3-meter-tall structure of reinforced stone and mana, glowing runes at the joints, A-class. Then he looked at the balcony where the guildmaster stood and politely asked if he could fix the sword first. Someone on the balcony snorted. Someone laughed. The guildmaster raised an eyebrow. The girl with the icy face didn't laugh. She tilted her head slightly. Dan sat down on the floor right in the middle of the training ground. He took off the backpack they'd allowed him to bring from the hospital. He took out 3 items: a shard of black bone the size of a pinky finger, a piece of wire from a pair of headphones, those very ones, the ones a female hunter from the rescue team had given him on the 2nd day when he was in the ward trying to listen to music through his phone's speaker and couldn't figure out how to turn down the volume. And the third item, a small capsule of low-grade manna from the first aid kit. It grew quieter on the balcony. People were watching. Cameras were recording. Dan placed the government-issued sword in front of him. He picked up a bone fragment. He rubbed it between his palms. The bone crunched and turned into a fine black powder. Dan opened the manna capsule. A drop of blue liquid fell onto the powder. The powder hissed. Then it began to glow. A dim, purple light. Dan took a piece of wire from the headphones. He bent it. He wrapped it around the hilt of the service sword. He ran his finger along the blade, slowly, from the base to the tip, leaving a thin trail of black powder mixed with manna behind his finger. The powder soaked into the steel like water into sand. The blade darkened. It changed, from gray to black, from dull to matte. Dan raised the sword. He looked at it. He tapped the blade with his finger. The sound changed. Before, it had been the dull thud of cheap steel. Now, it was a clear ring, like a bell. 7 minutes. Exactly 7 minutes since he sat down on the floor. Dan stood up. He turned toward the golem. No one on the balcony was laughing. Everyone was staring at the sword. At the black blade that 3 minutes ago had been mass-produced steel for a D rank. Dan took one step forward, then a second. On the third step, he was at the golem. He wasn't running. He wasn't speeding up. He wasn't using the system's skills. He just stepped. 3 steps of 20 meters each. His body moved the way it moves after 100 years of continuous combat, without thought, without effort, like breathing. He struck once, from top to bottom, a simple movement, first-year textbook stuff. The sword passed through the A-class golem as if through warm air. The upper half of the golem slid to the side and collapsed to the floor. The reinforced wall behind the golem cracked. The crack ran from floor to ceiling. Absorption runes along the edges of the crack flashed and faded. The third-level barrier flickered and vanished. In the ensuing silence, the sound of fine stone dust falling from the ceiling to the floor could be heard. Dan raised his sword. He examined the blade. Not a scratch. He turned toward the balcony. 30 people stood motionless on the balcony. Inspector Park's jaw dropped. Guildmaster Cha Minju stood with his back straight and his face pale. The girl with the icy expression stood motionless, but Dan noticed that she was gripping the balcony railing so tightly that the metal beneath her fingers was covered in frost. S rank with the ice element. Her ability reacted to emotions, so she had sensed something. Dan didn't understand exactly what. He looked at the broken golem and the cracked wall. Then he said guiltily that he hadn't calculated it right. He'd thought the golem was tougher. The silence lasted another 3 seconds. Then Inspector Park cursed under his breath. And that was the only sound in the hall for the next minute. The video from the testing ground hit the internet 2 hours later. Someone among the 30 people on the balcony had recorded everything on their phone and posted it. 6 hours later, it had been viewed 4 million times. 12 hours later, it was on every news site on the planet. The headlines all screamed the same thing. Dead hunter returns from the dungeon after 5 years. Max level. 1 hit on an A-class golem. Wall destroyed. Who is So Ji-hwan? Dan didn't know about the video. He was sitting on the floor by the wall in his ward, eating rice porridge from a plastic bowl. The porridge was bland, warm, incredibly delicious. He ate slowly. He held every spoonful in his mouth for 10 seconds. He'd been doing this with every meal since his return. Because in the desert, food was raw, tough, sometimes poisonous. Every bite had to be checked with his tongue before swallowing. His body remembered. Inspector Park walked in without knocking. His face was grim. He said there was a problem. The video had leaked. The world now knows who Dan is. Dan looked up from his porridge. He asked what that meant. Inspector Park explained. The world's 7 largest guilds had already sent contract offers, sums with 9 zeros. 3 governments had sent official requests for a meeting. The American embassy was calling every 20 minutes. 16 journalists were standing outside the hospital. Dan finished his porridge. He set the bowl on the floor. Then he asked if he could just leave. Inspector Park said he could leave. Dan was a free man. But on the street, people recognize him. His face is on every screen in the country. Dan thought for a moment. Then he asked if there was a place where he could live in peace, where there are no journalists, where there are no guilds, where he can just sit and do nothing. Inspector Park said that the association had provided him with temporary housing, a studio apartment in the Hongdae district, small, quiet, under a false name on the paperwork. Dan nodded. That night they took him out through the hospital's back exit. A black car with no flashing lights, tinted windows. A silent association agent was behind the wheel. Dan looked out the window at Seoul at night. Lights, signs, neon advertising strips on every building. An energy drink featuring the face of an S-rank hunter. A bank card for hunters with cashback for raids. Life insurance with special terms for A-rank and above. The world had built an entire economy on hunters. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building in an alley off the main street of Hongdae. One room, a kitchen, a bathroom. The window looked out onto the wall of the neighboring house. Dan walked in. He set his backpack on the floor. He leaned his black-bone sword against the wall. He looked around. A bed, a table, a chair, a small refrigerator. He opened the refrigerator. Inside were containers of prepared food, rice, kimchi, boiled eggs, a bottle of water. On the table lay a note from Inspector Park, a contact phone number, the address of the nearest store, and a note. Don't post anything online, please. Dan didn't understand why the note was there. He didn't even know how to post anything online. He sat down on the floor against the wall. Out of habit, his back pressed against the hard surface, his legs bent, his hands on his knees. He sat like that for 100 years. He would sit like that until his body forgot. Sounds from the street drifted in through the window. Music from the bar downstairs. Laughter, conversations, life, ordinary human life. Dan closed his eyes. He tried to sleep. He couldn't. The silence felt wrong. In the desert, silence meant a creature was creeping up. In the desert, silence meant death. Here, silence meant peace. But his body didn't know the difference. He opened his eyes and sat there until dawn. In the morning, he went out onto the street, for the first time, alone, unescorted. The sun was low and warm. The alley smelled of coffee from the cafe on the corner and wet asphalt after the morning street cleaning. Dan walked slowly. He looked at everything. Store signs, people with phones in their hands, a girl on a bicycle, an old man with a dog, a cat on a second-story windowsill. Dan stopped and looked at the cat. The cat looked at him. Ginger, fat, well-fed, lazy. The cat yawned. Dan yawned back. It was the first living creature in 100 years that hadn't tried to kill him. He stood there looking at the cat for 3 minutes. Then he walked on. The cafe on the corner was small. 4 tables, a bar counter. Behind the counter stood a girl of about 20 in an apron. Dan went inside. The smell of coffee hit him so hard that he stopped in the doorway. The last time he'd had coffee was 100 years ago, or 5 years ago, depends on your point of reference. He walked up to the counter. The girl smiled and asked what he wanted to order. Dan looked at the menu above her head. Latte, Americano, cappuccino, flat white, iced something, mocha something, matcha something. He didn't know half the words. He stood there staring at the menu for so long that the girl behind the counter started to get nervous. Then he said he wanted coffee, just coffee, no frills. The girl asked what size. Dan looked at the 3 cups of different sizes on the counter. He chose the smallest one. The girl said that would be 3,800 over there. Dan took out the card the association had given him. He held it up to the terminal. The terminal beeped. The girl handed him the cup. Dan took it with both hands. Like a bottle of water in a hospital, he sat down at a table by the window. He raised the cup to his face. Steam rose up, hot, bitter, real. He took his first sip. He closed his eyes. The coffee was ordinary, cheap, probably from a vending machine. But for a man who had spent 100 years drinking water squeezed from the blood of demons, it was the best coffee in the universe. He sat in the cafe, drinking coffee and looking out the window at people going about their business, unaware that sitting right next to them was a man who was 127 years old, and this man was crying. Quietly, silently. Tears simply streamed down his cheeks and dripped into his coffee. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't even realize right away that he was crying. He hadn't cried in 100 years. In the desert, tears were a luxury. Water was too precious to waste on his eyes. But here, in a small cafe in Hongdae, for 3,800 won, he could afford it. During his first week in the apartment, Dan learned how to be human. It turned out to be harder than killing an A-rank demon. The shower. He stood under the water for 40 minutes the first time. He didn't wash, he just stood there. The water ran over his scars, and he couldn't bring himself to step out. There was no water in the desert. He washed with sand. He rubbed his skin with a stone until he'd scraped off the top layer of dirt. But here, the water flowed endlessly, hot, clean, free. It seemed like a mistake. Someone was bound to come and turn it off. No one came. Cooking. He opened the container of rice. The rice was white, soft, perfect. He ate it with his hands. Then he remembered that chopsticks existed. He found them in a drawer. He took them. His hands remembered how to hold them. Muscle memory is older than 100 years of the desert. He ate all the rice and sat with the empty container in his hands for 5 minutes. Because in the desert, an empty container meant it could be 3 days until the next meal. Here, he could open the fridge and take another one. But his body didn't believe it. He still couldn't sleep in the bed. He slept on the floor by the wall. 4 hours at most. Then he'd wake up from the silence. The silence woke him more reliably than any alarm clock. On the 3rd day, he found a white noise app on his phone. Forest sounds, rain sounds, ocean sounds. He turned on the rain, lay down on the floor. He listened. 20 minutes later, he fell asleep. He slept for 6 hours, a record in 100 years. On the 4th day, he went to the store, a small 24-hour store 3 minutes from his apartment. There was so much inside that his head spun. Rows of shelves, packaged food, drinks, snacks. 20 different kinds of instant ramen. He stood in front of the ramen shelf and couldn't decide. He hadn't chosen his food in 100 years. He ate whatever was available, whatever he managed to carve out of a killed animal without dying. Here, he was offered a choice between spicy and mild, between pork and beef, between cheese and seafood. He stood there so long that the clerk came over and asked if everything was okay. Dan looked at him. Then he pointed to the shelf and asked which one was the best. The clerk pointed to the red package and said that was the most popular one. Dan took 3. Then he thought about it and took 3 more. At the register, he fumbled with the payment for a long time. Card, terminal, bag. The clerk waited patiently. Dan left the store with a bag and a sense of victory. He had just made a purchase, by himself, without help. It was his first independent action in this new world. On the 5th day, the first offer came in person, not through the association, not through the mail. A man in an expensive suit was standing at the door of his apartment. Dan opened the door with a sword in his hand, out of habit. The man turned pale. He introduced himself. An envoy from the Golden Dragon Guild, the richest guild in Asia, based in Tokyo. He held out an envelope. Inside were the terms of the contract. Dan looked at the numbers. Then he looked at the envoy and asked how much that was. Not in won, but in things he could understand. How many cups of coffee? The envoy blinked. Then he calculated. Then he said about 200 million cups of coffee. Dan thought about it. Then he said he didn't need that much, and he closed the door. An hour later, the next one arrived. The Scarlet Phoenix Guild, Korea. Even better terms. Dan opened the door, this time without a sword. Progress. He listened. He refused. He closed the door. 2 hours later, another one. The Silver Tiger. Then the Americans. Then the Europeans. By the evening of the 5th day, 11 people had been at his door. Dan turned them all down. Not out of pride, not on principle. He just didn't understand why he needed a guild. He'd been alone for 100 years. He knew how to be alone. He didn't know how to be with someone. On the 6th day, Inspector Park called and said that Dan's address had been leaked. Most likely, one of the guild envoys had leaked the information. Now the journalists knew where he lived. He'd either have to move or learn to live with cameras outside his window. Dan looked out the window. A man with a long lens was standing on the roof of the neighboring building. Dan drew the curtain. Then he thought. Then he made a decision. He wouldn't run away. He'd been running for 100 years. From the creatures, from the fog, from death. Enough. He would stay in Hongdae. He would find something to do. Something he was good at. Something that made sense. On the 7th day, he went out onto the street and walked down the alley. Past the cafe where he'd cried over his coffee. Past the store where he'd bought ramen. Further on. Around the corner. Even further. And he found what he was looking for. An empty space on the ground floor of an old building. A former laundromat. Closed. A for rent sign on the door. Dan peered through the window. Inside, it was empty. Concrete floor, bare walls, sturdy ceiling. Enough space for an anvil. Enough height for a forge. Good ventilation. 2 exits. He called the number on the sign. The landlord answered. Dan asked how much the rent was. The landlord named a price. Dan didn't know if that was a lot or a little, but he said he'd take it. The landlord asked what he planned to do there. Dan answered, repairs and forging. The landlord asked what he would be forging. Dan said, weapons, for hunters. The landlord paused. Then he said there were already 3 workshops in the area that repaired hunting gear. All 3 belonged to major guilds. They had equipment worth millions of won. Dan nodded, though the landlord couldn't see that over the phone. Then he said he didn't need equipment worth millions. He needed a hammer, an anvil, and hands. The next day, he signed the lease. Inspector Park helped with the paperwork. Dan spent the entire first day setting up. He found an old metal plate in the building's basement. It became his anvil. He made the hammer himself from a piece of rebar and a concrete block. He built the forge from bricks he found at a dump 2 blocks away. He used a drop of his own mana to light the fire. When he was done, he stood in the middle of the empty room and looked at his workshop. Rough, simple, ugly, but functional. He hung a piece of cardboard on the door. He wrote on the cardboard with a marker, so, repairs and forging, and he waited. His first client was a girl, short, skinny, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She was wearing a worn uniform without a guild emblem, a freelancer, a hunter without a contract. She stood in the doorway of the workshop holding a spear, or rather, what was left of it. The shaft was split in 2. The tip was held on by a single rivet. The grip wrapping was worn down to the thread. It was a spear that had been repaired at least 20 times. Dan sat at the anvil, sharpening his hammer. He looked up. He looked at the girl, then at the spear, then back at the girl. She said she needed it repaired. She asked how much it would cost. Dan stood up. He walked over. He held out his hand. The girl handed in the spear. Dan took it. He turned it over in his hands. He weighed it in his palm. He ran his finger along the crack in the shaft, over the tip, over the wrapping. The spear was cheap, C-rank at best, mass-produced. They churned these out in the Whitestone Guild's factories by the 1,000 every month. But this spear was different, not in quality, because of its history. 20 repairs. Each time, the owner had it repaired instead of buying a new one. So this spear was dear to her, or she didn't have the money for a new one, or both. Dan looked at the girl. He asked how she held the spear in battle, right or left. The girl blinked. Then she said, right, but she crosses over with her left for thrusting strikes. Dan nodded. He asked where she struck more often, the torso or the head. The girl said, the torso. She's short. The head is too high for her. Dan nodded again. He sat down at the anvil. He placed the spear in front of him. The girl asked how long she had to wait. Dan said, 10 minutes. The girl sat down on a box by the door. Dan worked. He removed the tip. He straightened the shaft. From his backpack, he took out a small pouch of black powder, the same powder made from demon bone that he'd used during testing. He applied a thin layer to the crack. The powder soaked in. The crack disappeared. The shaft became stronger than it had been when new. He reforged the tip with 3 blows of the hammer. He changed the angle of the edge. Before, the tip had been sharpened for general use. Now it was sharpened for a thrusting strike to the torso, for the arm of a man 5 feet 6 inches tall, for a switch from right to left. He remade the wrapping from a strip of leather he'd cut from his demon hide cloak. The leather was soft and didn't slip. 10 minutes later, he lifted the spear. He examined it. He handed it to the girl. She took it. Her eyes widened. She made a test lunge right there in the workshop. The spear whistled through the air. The sound was different, cleaner, sharper. The girl looked at Dan, then at the spear, then back at Dan. She asked how much she owed him. Dan opened his mouth, closed it. He didn't know how much it cost to repair a weapon. He had no idea. There was no money in the desert. He said it was free. The girl frowned. She said that wasn't right. That work had to be paid for. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said she could pay later, once he figured out the prices. The girl looked at him for a long time. Then she introduced herself. Kim So-gyung, B rank, freelancer. Dan nodded, introduced himself in return. So Ji-hwan, but you can call me Dan. So-gyung tucked her spear behind her back, turned toward the door, stopped, turned back, said she'd be back. Dan said he was here every day. So-gyung left. Dan sat back down at the anvil. He looked at his hands. They smelled of metal and leather, a familiar smell, a good smell. He had done something useful for a living person, for the first time in 100 years. The feeling was strange, warm, uncomfortable, like a bed he couldn't lie down on, but good. The next day, Sogyun returned, not alone. Another hunter was with her, C rank, young, with a cracked shield. Dan repaired the shield in 8 minutes. On the third day, 3 people came. On the 5th, 6. On the 7th, Dan stopped counting. They came from morning till night. Young, low-rank hunters, freelancers, those who couldn't afford guild workshops. Those who went on raids with weapons that fell apart in their hands. Those whom no one noticed. Dan repaired everything. Swords, spears, bows, shields, gauntlets, greaves, even the backpack of one D-rank guy whose strap had snapped before a raid. He didn't take any money, not because he didn't want to. He just forgot to ask every time, or couldn't figure out the price, or felt awkward. On the 10th day, Inspector Pak stopped by the workshop. He saw a line of 7 people at the door. He went inside. Dan was sitting at the anvil, reforging an arrowhead. Inspector Park sat down on a box and asked how much Dan had earned in 10 days. Dan said 0. Inspector Park rubbed the bridge of his nose. Then he said that renting the space costs money, that electricity costs money, that food costs money, that Dan can't work for free. Dan looked at him. Then he said he didn't know how much to charge. Inspector Park took out his phone. He opened the Silver Tiger Guild Workshop's website. He showed the price list. Repairing a D-rank sword, 120,000 won. Repairing a C-rank spear, 250,000 won. Forging a new B-rank dagger, 2 million won. Dan looked at the numbers. Then he looked at Inspector Park. Then he said that was too much. The girl who came in with the cracked shield couldn't afford that kind of money. The guy with the backpack even less so. Inspector Park said Dan could set his own prices, below market rate, but not 0. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said, 10,000 won for any repair. Inspector Park looked at him like he was crazy. 10,000 won is the price of a cup of coffee and a pastry. Dan said that was fair. 1 cup of coffee for a repair. Inspector Park opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then he waved his hand and said it was his business. Dan nodded. From that day on, the workshop began operating at the new price, 10,000 won for anything. 3 weeks after the workshop opened, a woman in a business suit came to see Dan. Tall, heels, shoulder-length hair. A Silver Tiger Guild badge gleamed on her jacket lapel. A silver stripe. S rank. Dan recognized her. The girl from the training ground balcony, the one whose touch had left frost on the railing. She stood in the workshop doorway, surveying the room. An anvil made of a metal plate, a hammer made of rebar and concrete, a forge made of bricks, a line of 4 hunters standing on crates against the wall. She looked at all of this, and not a single muscle in her face twitched. Then she stepped inside. The line parted. 4 low-ranking hunters looked at her as if she were a creature from another world. And in a sense, she was. Between her and them lay a chasm 10 levels of strength and 100 levels of income wide. She approached Dan. She introduced herself. Cha Yuna, second sword of the Silver Tiger Guild. Dan nodded. He said he remembered her from the trials. Yuna raised an eyebrow slightly. She asked what exactly he remembered. Dan said she had frozen the railing. Yuna fell silent for 2 seconds. Then she said she had come with an official offer. The Silver Tiger Guild wanted to offer him a contract. Not an ordinary one, a special one. He would be the guild's chief blacksmith. His own workshop. Any equipment, any materials. A salary he sets himself. The only condition, exclusivity. He forges only for the Silver Tiger. Dan listened. Then he looked at the line against the wall. A D-rank guy with a bent sword. A C-rank girl with a cracked bow. A middle-aged B-rank man with a broken gauntlet. And Sogyun, who hadn't come to have her weapon repaired, just to sit. She came every day, sat on a crate, watched Dan work. Sometimes she brought him food, rice balls from the shop around the corner. Dan looked at them, then at Yuna. Then he said he couldn't. Yuna asked why. Dan nodded toward the line. He said these people couldn't go to the Silver Tiger's workshop. They had no money. They had no contracts. They came here because they had nowhere else to go. If he left, they'd go on raids again with broken weapons. Yuna was silent. Her expression didn't change. But Dan noticed that the temperature in the workshop had dropped by half a degree. Her element was reacting to emotions. He didn't know which ones exactly. She said she understood. She turned around. She walked toward the door. She stopped. She turned back. She asked if the workshop accepted S-rank clients. Dan said it accepted everyone for 10,000 won. Yuna looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she turned and left. The next day she sent a courier. The courier brought a white leather scabbard. Inside lay a sword, S-rank, ice steel. The blade was covered with a thin layer of frost even inside the scabbard. The hilt was wrapped in silver thread, a beautiful sword, expensive and unfortunate. Dan took it out of the scabbard, weighed it in his palm, turned it over. He ran his finger along the blade. The sword trembled, not from the cold, from an improper balance. Someone had forged it not for Yuna. Someone had forged it for the idea of an S-rank hunter, to a template, to a standard. The blade was too long for her height. The hilt was too thick for her palm. The center of gravity was shifted toward the tip, though judging by her build, Yuna should work with a balance closer to the hilt. Dan sat with the sword in his hands and thought. He had seen Yuna once on the balcony of the training ground, for a few seconds. That wasn't enough. He needed to see how she moved, how she breathes in combat, which foot is her lead foot, how she crosses the sword when changing stances. He called the number the courier had left. Yuna answered after 2 rings. Dan said he needed to see how she fought. Yuna was silent. Then she said he could come to the morning training session at the Silver Tiger training ground, tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Dan arrived at 5:30. He sat down on a bench by the wall of the training ground. Yuna's sword lay on her lap in its sheath. At 6 sharp, Yuna appeared. A white training uniform, her hair in a ponytail, her face calm as always. She stepped onto the training ground and began her warm-up. Dan watched. Not her body, not her face, her hands, at her wrists, at how her fingers gripped the air with every movement, at how her weight shifted from her left foot to her right, at how her shoulder dropped 2 degrees before a horizontal swing. Yuna finished her warm-up. She picked up her training sword. She began working with her shadow, a series of strikes, fast, precise, beautiful, and wrong. Dan saw it clearly. She was adjusting to the sword. Every movement was a micro-compensation. The blade is too long. She shortens her swing. The hilt is too thick. She loosens her grip on her pinky. Her center of gravity is off. She puts extra effort into her wrist with every strike. Thousands of micro-compensations, every day, for years. She'd gotten used to it. She didn't even notice, but Dan noticed. For 100 years, he'd survived by noticing every detail, every movement, every wrong angle. He stood up. Yuna stopped. She looked at him. Dan said he'd seen enough. Yuna asked what he'd seen. Dan said her sword didn't suit her, that she was wasting 30% of her energy compensating for others' mistakes, that if she eliminated that 30%, she would become a third stronger without a single new skill. Yuna was silent. The temperature in the training ground dropped. Frost formed on the walls. She asked how he knew. Dan said he didn't make weapons. He makes tools for a specific hand. He took the sword and left. In the workshop, he worked on it for 3 days. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just worked. He shortened the blade by 4 centimeters. He narrowed the hilt by 1 millimeter. He shifted the center of gravity toward the hand. He added a drop of black bone powder to the steel to enhance the conductivity of ice mana. He wrapped the hilt in leather from his cloak. When he finished, he examined the sword. It had become different, not more beautiful, not bigger, not brighter, but right. For her. Only for her. Yuna came to collect the sword on the 4th day. Dan held the sword out to her, hilt first. Yuna took it. She froze. Her fingers wrapped around the hilt, and for the first time in all the years she had held this sword, the hilt fit into her palm like an extension of her arm. She made a test swing. The air cracked. The blade left a 4-meter-long trail of frost in the air. Yuna lowered the sword. She looked at it, then at Dan. Her expression didn't change, but tiny ice crystals glistened on her eyelashes. She was crying. In her own way. She asked how much she owed. Dan told her, 10,000 won. Yuna silently took out her card and paid. Then she left. At the door, she turned around and said one word, "Thank you." The temperature in the workshop didn't return to normal until an hour after she left. In the 4th week, a ray of sunshine in human form burst into the workshop. A girl of about 22, tall, tanned, hair dyed honey blonde, huge headphones dangled from her neck, a bow hung on her back, long, curved, with a blue glow of mana on the bowstring. She entered noisily. She bumped her shoulder against the doorframe. She cursed in English, then in Korean. Then she saw Dan and froze. Then she pointed at him and said in Korean with a strong American accent that she recognized him, that he was the guy from the video. Dan was sitting at the anvil, looking at her. She reminded him of something, not physically, in her energy, in the way she moved, quickly, sweeping, without looking back, as if the world couldn't hurt her. He knew people like that, or rather, he remembered them from before the desert. She introduced herself, Emily Park, but you can just call me M. A rank, archer, from Los Angeles, on an internship in Korea. Dan said he was from Los Angeles too. Emily opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she switched to English and said that was amazing, that she was a fellow Los Angelino with a legend. Dan replied in English. His English was rusty, 100 years without practice, but he still remembered the language. Emily sat down on a box next to So-kyung, who, as usual, was sitting in the corner with rice balls. Emily looked at So-gyeon. So-gyeon looked at Emily. Emily held out her hand and said hello. So-gyeon shook her hand and said nothing. Emily turned to Dan and asked if he could take a look at her bow. Not to fix it. It's not broken, just to look at it. She'd heard that he saw things in weapons that others didn't. Dan held out his hand. Emily took the bow off her shoulder and handed it to him. Dan took it. Heavy. A-rank material. Good work. American forging school. He ran his finger along the bow, along the string, along the grip. Then he looked at Emily's hands, at her fingers, at the pads of her index and middle fingers, at the calluses, at the small scar between her thumb and index finger. Then he looked her in the face and asked how long her hands had been shaking. Emily stopped smiling, instantly. Like a switch. Sojun in the corner looked up. Dan pointed to the bowstring. He said the draw weight was set 2% higher than normal. Archers do that when their fingers start to shake. They increase the draw weight to compensate for the tremor, but it only helps for the first few months. Then it gets worse, because the muscles tire faster and the tremor intensifies. Emily was silent. The smile was gone. Beneath it was something else, something dark and quiet. She said that 2 years ago she lost a partner on a raid. His name was Jake, B rank, tank. He stood between her and an A-rank demon to give her time to shoot. She fired. She hit. The demon fell. But by then, Jake wasn't breathing anymore. Ever since then, her hands have been shaking. Panic attacks before every raid. The pills help for 3 hours, then it all comes back. Dan listened, silently. He didn't nod. He didn't say he understood, because he wasn't sure he did. He lost everyone at once, 100 years ago. The whole world, all people, all connections. But that was so long ago that the pain had dried up like blood on stone. But her pain was fresh. 2 years. For her, it was yesterday. He laid the bow on the anvil, opened his backpack, took out a piece of white bone. Not black, white. It was the bone of a creature he'd killed in the 62nd year, an A-rank beast that hadn't attacked. It sat in the fog and hummed, a low, deep sound. The vibration from that sound was soothing. It slowed his heartbeat. It eased his anxiety. Dan killed it because in the desert, anything that moved was a threat. But he kept the bone, because when he held it in his hand, the tremor in his own fingers stopped. And he did have a tremor. After he turned 50, when some creature tore his right arm from wrist to elbow, and he sewed it up himself with threads from the demon's tendons. The arm healed, but his fingers trembled. They trembled for 20 years, until he found this bone. He carved a thin plate from the white bone, polished it, bent it, made a bracelet. Simple, narrow, with a single property. When squeezed, the plate released a faint pulse of mana, that very low hum, invisible, inaudible. But his nervous system sensed it and calmed down. He worked for an hour. Emily sat on a box and watched, silently. No jokes, no smile. When Dan finished, he walked over to her. He took her right hand. Her fingers were trembling. Slightly, almost imperceptibly. But he saw it. He slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, fastened it. He told her to clench her fist when the tremor started. Tightly, for 3 seconds. Then let go. Emily clenched her fist. 3 seconds. Let go. Her fingers weren't trembling. She raised her hand, looked at her fingers, spread them apart, clenched them, spread them apart. No shaking. She stared at her hand for so long that Dan thought she'd forgotten where she was. Then she looked up at him. Her eyes were filled with tears. But she was smiling. That same wide, sunny smile she'd had when she walked into the workshop. Only now that smile was real. She asked how much it cost. Dan said 10,000 won. Emily laughed. Then she cried. Then she laughed again. Then she said he was crazy, and that she would come every day from now on. Dan didn't understand why, if her weapon was fine. Emily said she didn't need a blacksmith. She needed a friend. Dan didn't know what to say. He hadn't had friends in 100 years. He didn't remember how it worked. So he just nodded. Emily came the next day, with coffee. 2 cups. One for him. She sat on a crate next to Sojan, started chatting. Sojan answered in one-word answers. Emily didn't give up. An hour later, Sojan smiled. A small smile, a quick one, but Dan noticed. The workshop was changing. It was ceasing to be a place where guns were repaired. It was becoming a place where people sat side by side and were quiet. In the 6th week, Dan had lunch with another person for the first time. It was Sojan. She brought 2 containers of kimbap from the store. She placed one in front of him on the anvil. She said he needed to eat properly, that he was too skinny. Dan looked at the container, then at Sogyeon. Then he opened the container. Rice, seaweed, carrots, egg. Everything was cut neatly, beautifully, evenly. He picked up his chopsticks. Sogyeon picked up hers. They ate in silence, side by side, in silence, without words. Dan noticed his hands were shaking, not from tremors, from something else, from the fact that a living person was sitting across from him, eating the same food. And this person didn't want to kill him, didn't want anything from him, just sitting there and eating. He finished the kimbap, put down his chopsticks, said thank you. Sogyeon nodded. Then she said she'd bring something better tomorrow. She knows a place where they make real homemade kimbap, not the store-bought kind. Dan said the store-bought kind was good too. Sogyeon looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that he deserved better than just good. Dan didn't understand what she meant, but he remembered. That evening, a black car pulled up to the workshop. A woman got out, tall, suit, short hair, freckles on her nose, a sharp gaze, professional. She walked into the workshop and introduced herself, Rebecca Liu, but everyone calls her Becky, A-rank, healer, and alchemist. She said she had arrived from New York 3 days ago, that she worked as an investigative journalist for a major American news agency, that she wanted to write an article about him. Dan said no. Becky smiled. She said he hadn't even heard the terms yet. Dan repeated no. Becky didn't leave. She sat down on a box by the door, the very one where Sogyeon usually sits. She took out her phone. She started typing something. Dan looked at her. He asked what she was doing. Becky said she was waiting. Sooner or later, he'd change his mind, or she'd see something interesting, one or the other. She wasn't in a hurry. Dan went back to work. In front of him on the anvil lay a D-rank bracelet with a crack running down the middle. He started repairing it. Becky sat and watched, quietly. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't take any photos. She just watched. 2 hours later, Emily came in with coffee. She saw Becky. She looked at her. Becky looked at Emily. Emily asked who she was. Becky said she was a journalist. Emily frowned. She looked at Dan. Dan shrugged. He said she'd come on her own and was sitting there on her own. He couldn't kick someone out of the workshop. He didn't know the rules. Maybe that's just how it is in this world. Maybe journalists always sit in workshops. Emily laughed. She said, no, that's not the custom. Becky smiled and said that now it is. That's how Becky's first week in the workshop went. She came every day. She sat on a box. She watched. Sometimes she jotted something down on her phone. Sometimes she just sat there. On the 3rd day, Dan noticed that she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at his hands, at how he worked with the materials, how he mixed bone powder with mana, how he applied it to the metal, how he changed the structure of the weapon in minutes. She was an alchemist. She understood what he was doing. And what he was doing wasn't described in any textbook. On the 5th day, she asked her first question, not as a journalist, as an alchemist. She asked how the black powder interacted with low-rank mana, why there was no rejection. By all the laws of alchemy, material from a high-rank creature should destroy low-rank mana upon contact. Dan looked up. He looked at her. For the first time in 5 days, he looked at her closely. She had asked the right question. The first right question anyone had asked him since his return. He explained, simply, briefly. In the desert, he had no choice of materials. He worked with what was available, high-rank bones and low-rank mana. Through 30 years of trial and error, he had found a way. Don't mix them directly. Grind the bone into powder. This destroys the internal structure of the rank. The powder becomes neutral. Then add mana. The mana fills the voids in the powder's structure, like water fills sand. No conflict, symbiosis. Becky listened. Her eyes were burning. She said it turned the entire theory of alchemy on its head, that if this could be scaled up, cheap materials could be turned into high-rank ones, that it would change the hunting equipment market, that it could save the lives of thousands of hunters who die with cheap weapons because they can't afford expensive ones. Dan shrugged. He said that it was just forging. Becky shook her head. She said it wasn't just forging, it was a revolution, and she didn't want to write the article anymore. She wants to study. Dan asked, "What about journalism?" Becky paused. Then she said that 2 years ago she wasn't a journalist, but a field medic with the Guild in New York. Her last patient died in her arms, a B-rank hunter, 23 years old, poisoned by a toxin from an A-rank dungeon. There was only one antidote, an extract from the core of a specific type of demon. Becky couldn't find it in time. The guy died. She left medicine and went into journalism because she decided that articles don't kill people. But now, sitting in this workshop, she watches Dan turn trash into salvation and realizes she ran away for nothing, that her hands aren't meant for a keyboard, but for a crucible and a mortar. Dan listened. Then he stood up. He walked over to his backpack. He opened the side pocket. He took out a small vial. Inside was a thick green liquid. He held out the vial to Becky. Becky took it. She looked at it. She asked what it was. Dan said it was an extract from the core of a toxin demon. He'd made it back in '80 in the desert, from an A-rank creature, a universal antidote for most known toxins of the other side. He had 3 of them. This one was extra. Becky held the vial with both hands. She looked at it. 2 years ago, her patient had died because she hadn't had exactly this, and this man had just given it to her as if it were surplus, just like that. She looked up at Dan. Then she said quietly that she was staying, not as a journalist, not as an alchemist, as herself. Dan nodded. Then he said the box by the door was already taken, so John and Emily were sitting on it. Becky would have to find her own. Becky laughed. For the first time in 5 days, loudly, openly, without her professional mask. The next day she came with her folding chair. By the 2nd month, the workshop had changed, not physically. Physically, it was still a former laundromat with a stovetop anvil and a brick forge. But people now lived inside it, not literally. Although Emily once fell asleep on the crates and slept until morning, they came every day. Sojourn first, at 7 in the morning, with rice balls or kimbap. She would sit in the corner and sharpen her spear, silently, quietly, as if she had always been there. Emily was second, at 9, with coffee for everyone, loud, noisy, filling the silence like water fills a glass. Becky was third, at 10, with a folding chair and a notebook. She wrote down everything Dan did, every movement, every material, every proportion. She was building her own system of the alchemy of the other side. Yuna rarely came. Once a week, without warning, she stood by the door. She watched. Sometimes she left an envelope with money on the anvil, though Dan didn't ask for it and didn't take it. He returned the envelopes via courier. Yuna sent them again. It became their silent ritual. Clients came and went, 10, 20, 30 a day. The line stretched from the door to the corner of the alley. Word of the workshop where, for 10,000 won, they repaired weapons better than in the guild workshops for millions, had spread throughout the Korean hunting scene. Dan worked from morning till night. Emily said he needed a day off. Dan asked what a day off was. Emily looked at him, then at Sogyong. Sogyong shrugged. She didn't know what a day off was either. She'd been working every day for the past 3 years. Emily grabbed both of their hands and said they were going. Where? Dan asked. To eat, Emily said. Real food, not store-bought kimbap, not rice balls, real food at a real table. They went to a small Korean barbecue restaurant 2 blocks from the workshop. Dan walked down the street and felt strange. He was walking with 2 people on the sidewalk, past shops and cafes, like a normal person. 3 months ago, he had been standing in a concrete wasteland, counting the days. Now he was walking to a restaurant. The world didn't make sense to him. At the restaurant, Emily ordered meat, lots of meat. 3 kinds: rice, salad, banchan, soup. Dan looked at the table piled high with food and couldn't move. Sogyeon noticed. She quietly placed a piece of meat on his plate. Dan looked at the meat, at the plate, at the chopsticks in his hand. Then he began to eat, slowly. The meat was hot, juicy, salty, real. He chewed each bite for 20 seconds, as always, a habit from the desert, to check with his tongue, to make sure it wasn't poisonous, then to swallow. Emily chattered non-stop. She talked about Los Angeles, about her family, about the cat she'd left with her parents, about how she first woke up during her sophomore year of college, right in the middle of an art history lecture. A system window popped up before her eyes, and she screamed so loudly that the professor called an ambulance. Sojun listened and smiled occasionally. Dan listened and ate meat. He was scared, not because of the food, not because of the people, because he felt good. He had forgotten that feeling. It lay somewhere deep beneath 100 years of stone and blood and loneliness, and now it was stirring, rising, like something alive that had been buried but not killed. He felt good, and that frightened him more than an A-rank demon, because feeling good meant there was something to lose, and he had already lost, once, the whole world, 100 years ago. He didn't want to lose again. After dinner, they walked down the street back to the workshop. Emily walked in the middle, waving her arms. She was talking about karaoke and how they absolutely had to go next week. Sogyeon walked on the right, quietly, hands in her pockets. Dan walked on the left, silently. He was looking at the streetlights, yellow light on the wet asphalt, beautiful. Emily suddenly stopped. She turned to Dan. She looked at him seriously. No smile. And she said that he had a right to be here, that this wasn't a dream, that no one would take this away from him. Dan looked at her. Then at Sogyeon. Sogyeon nodded. Dan didn't say anything, but something inside him shifted a millimeter, like a door that hadn't been opened in 100 years and had finally swung open just a little bit in the wind. That night, for the first time, he lay down on the bed. He didn't sit against the wall. He lay down, on his back, arms at his sides, no sword on his knees. The mattress sagged, spot, warm, strange. He lay there and stared at the ceiling. The silence was oppressive. He turned on his phone, opened the white noise app, turned on the rain, closed his eyes. 6 minutes later, he fell asleep. He slept for 7 hours. That night, he dreamed of a desert, gray stone, gray fog, silence. But in this dream, he wasn't alone. Someone was sitting next to him. He couldn't see their face. He could only see their hands. A woman's, small. They were holding his hand, and someone was singing, softly, a lullaby. An old Korean lullaby he'd heard 1,000 times over the past 100 years. He didn't remember the words, only the melody. The melody was warm and sad at the same time, like everything good in his life. He woke up at 4 in the morning. He sat up in bed. His heart was pounding. His hands were wet with sweat. He remembered the voice. He remembered the melody. He remembered the phrase, "Find me there. I'll come to you when I can." 40 years in the desert, the creature that spoke to him in Korean. It fed him, healed his wounds, and sang that lullaby every night. Then it disappeared. No, it didn't disappear. It pushed him out, back, to earth, sacrificed itself to open the door. He didn't remember the face. 100 years, and he didn't remember the face. Only the hands, only the voice, only the lullaby. He sat on the bed in the darkness of a small apartment in Hongdae and listened as Seoul woke up outside the window. Cars, birds, footsteps, life. He promised to find her, or she promised to come to him, or both. He didn't know who she was, human or demon, alive or dead, real or a dream born of 100 years of solitude. But he knew one thing: he would search, because she had saved him, and because he wanted to thank her, in person, looking into a face he didn't remember. In the morning, he arrived at the workshop before anyone else. He sat down at the anvil. He took out a piece of black bone and began to carve. A small figurine, a faceless woman, her hands folded in her lap, her head slightly tilted, as if listening or singing. He didn't know why he was carving it, but his hands knew. When Sogyeon came in at 7 in the morning with rice balls, she saw the figurine on the shelf above the anvil. She asked what it was. Dan said he didn't know. Someone he was looking for. Sogyun looked at the figurine, then at Dan. Then she said quietly that she hoped he would find him. Dan nodded. Then he took a rice ball. Then he said thank you, and they ate in silence again, side by side. Just like every morning, as if it had always been that way. In the third month, Dan found out that Sogyun lived in a room the size of a storage closet. He found out by accident. Sogyun was late to the workshop for the first time in 2 months. She came at 9 instead of 7, without any rice balls. Her eyes were red. Her hands were cold. Emily asked what was wrong. Sogyun said nothing was wrong. Dan looked at her jacket, at her shoes. The jacket was damp, not from the rain, from condensation. That's what happens when you sleep in an unheated room where the walls are covered in moisture. Her shoes were wet on the inside, not from puddles, from sweat. She had walked for a long time. He asked where she had been walking from. Sogyun didn't say anything. He asked again, quietly, without pressure. Sogyun said from Guro, a district in the southwest of Seoul, an hour and a half's walk to Hongdae. Emily asked why she walked. Sogyun said the bus fare had gone up. She did the math and realized that if she walked, she'd save 60,000 won a month. That would be enough for her younger brother's medication for a week. Emily fell silent. Becky, sitting on her folding chair, lowered her notebook. Dan looked at Sogyun, at her thin wrists, at the dark circles under her eyes, which had grown darker over the past month, at the way she held the spear, tighter than before, because her hands were weakening from malnutrition and her grip was compensating. He asked about her brother. Sogyun paused. Then she told him. Kim Dong-hyun, 15 years old, spinal injury, 4 years ago. Their mother left when Sogyun was 12. Her father died in a raid when she was 16. She awakened that same year. B rank, spear. She started working, freelancer, no guild, no insurance, no support. Everything she earned went toward her brother's medicine, on rent for a room in Guro, on food, on transportation, which she now replaced with her feet. Dan listened. Then he stood up, took off his apron, left the workshop. Sogyun asked where he was going. Dan didn't answer. He walked through Hongdae, past cafes, past shops, past bars with music. He was looking for something. 20 minutes later, he found it. The landlord of the building where the workshop was located lived 2 floors up. Dan knocked. The landlord opened the door. Dan asked if there was a vacant room in the building. The landlord said there was a small room on the 4th floor, a former storage room, 10 square meters, a window facing the courtyard, but it wasn't equipped for living, no furniture, no heating. Dan asked how much the rent was. The landlord named a price, 300,000 won a month. Dan said he'd take it. The landlord asked who it was for. Dan said for a workshop employee. The landlord shrugged and handed over the key. Dan returned to the workshop. He walked over to his backpack. He took out his tools, 2 bones, 1 black, 1 white, a skein of thread made from a demon's sinew, a piece of leather from a cloak. He worked all day. He didn't repair anyone else's weapons. For the first time in 2 months, the workshop was closed to customers. Emily wanted to ask what was going on, but Becky shook her head, and Emily fell silent. Sogyun sat in the corner and watched. She didn't understand. Dan was building. He carved hooks and loops out of black bone. He made plates out of white bone. He wove a net from the threads. He cut strips from the hide. By evening, he was finished. Things lay on the workshop floor. A folding bed made of bone plates on thread loops, compact, lightweight, warm. The white bone retained body heat. A pillow made of demon hide, stuffed with shavings from the black bone, soft. And a small lamp made from the core of a low-ranking demon. It glowed with a warm yellow light when touched. Dan gathered everything into a single bundle. He took the room key. He went up to the 4th floor. He opened the door. A small room, empty, clean, a window facing the courtyard. He made the bed. He placed the pillow. He set the lamp on the windowsill. Then he took a piece of cardboard and a marker out of his pocket. He wrote, Kim So-gyung. He attached it to the door. He went downstairs. He entered the workshop. So-gyung was sitting on a box. She was looking at him. He held out the key to her. So-gyung looked at the key, then at Dan. Then she asked what it was. Dan said it was a room on the 4th floor. Her room. A 3-minute walk to the workshop instead of an hour and a half. So-gyung didn't move. The key lay in Dan's palm. Small, silver, an ordinary key to an ordinary door. But for a girl who had slept for 3 years in a damp storage room in Guro, and walked an hour and a half to save money on the bus. This key weighed more than a sword made of black bone. Sogyun took the key. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold. She clenched it in her fist, pressed her fist to her chest, closed her eyes. Tears streamed from beneath her eyelashes. Quietly, soundlessly, she cried like someone who had forgotten how to cry out loud because there was no one to hear her. Emily stood by the wall, biting her lip. Becky, sitting on a folding chair, turned away. Dan didn't know what to do with a person who was crying. He stood there and waited. Then he remembered. In the desert, when he felt bad, he would place his hand on a rock. The firmness under his palm was soothing. He reached out and placed his hand on Sogyun's head, gently, just as you would place a hand on a rock. Firmly, yet tenderly at the same time. Sogyun didn't open her eyes, but she stopped trembling. A minute later, she lifted her head. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at Dan. She said one word, "Thank you." Dan nodded. Then he said there was no kitchen on the 4th floor, but he could make soup in the workshop, if she wanted. Sogyun started crying again. Emily couldn't hold back and started crying too. Becky pretended to be writing in her notebook, but the pen didn't touch the paper. That evening, Dan was left alone in the workshop. Everyone had gone their separate ways. Sogyun went up to her room, her own, for the first time in her life. Dan sat at the anvil. He looked at his hands. Today, he hadn't repaired a single sword. He hadn't reforged a single pommel. He built a bed and hung a nameplate, and that was the most important thing he'd done in 2 months, maybe in 100 years. The Rotten Dungeon opened in the Kanam district in the 5th month, B rank by classification, but it didn't close on schedule. Then creatures began emerging from it that the scanners couldn't identify. 3 raid groups went inside over the course of 2 weeks. The first returned with a full roster, but no results. The second lost 2 members. The third didn't return. The Hunters Association declared the dungeon anomalous and requested support from the major guilds. The Silver Tiger was the first to respond. Yuna called Dan. For the first time, she used to come in person or send a courier, but this time she called. Her voice was steady as always, but Dan heard something beneath the calm. She said the guild was organizing a reinforced raid on the anomalous dungeon in Kanam, an S-rank and A-rank team, 12 people. She wanted Dan to go with them, not as a fighter, as a consultant, because the creatures inside defy classification. And Dan is the only person on the planet who has spent 100 years in the other side and seen things no one else has. Dan was silent. Then he asked what kind of creatures. Yuna described them. Black, formless. They change size. They don't react to standard mana attacks. The scanner shows nothing, as if they aren't there. Dan closed his eyes. He knew for sure. These creatures were from his desert. He had encountered them after the 70th year. Formless, fluid. They weren't demons in the classical sense. They were something else. Fragments of the Iznanka itself. Pieces of space that had grown hungry. He killed them, but not with mana, not with steel, only with bone. Only with the substance of the otherworld against the otherworld. He told Yuna he would go, but not as a consultant. He would go inside, with them. Yuna was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, the raid in 3 days." Dan put down the phone. He looked at the workshop, at Sogyun, who was sharpening a spear in the corner, at Emily, who was drinking coffee on a crate, at Becky, who was mixing powders at the table by the window. He said he was going on a raid. 3 days. All 3 looked up at the same time. Emily was the first. She said she was going with him. Dan said no. Emily said she was an A-rank archer and had the right to go. Dan said those creatures didn't react to mana. Arrows were useless. Emily fell silent. Sojourn stood up. She said she wanted to go too. Dan looked at her. B rank, spear, against shapeless creatures. He said no. Sojourn pressed her lips together. She didn't argue, but Dan saw the knuckles on her fingers turn white as she gripped the spear shaft. Becky didn't say anything, but she took a first aid kit out of her bag and silently placed it on the anvil in front of Dan. Antidotes, bandages, 3 vials of green liquid, those very ones, the ones he'd given her. She'd return them, just in case they came in handy. Dan looked at the first aid kit, then at Becky, then he took it. He spent the 3 days before the raid forging, not for clients, for the raid. He forged 12 tips from black bone, thin, sharp, each the size of a finger. He attached them to steel rods. They turned out to be bolts, short, heavy, the only weapon that worked against the shapeless ones in the desert. Bone of the other side against the flesh of the other side. On the day of the raid, Dan arrived at the meeting point near the dungeon in Canham. 12 silver tiger hunters stood in battle gear, white suits with silver stripes, swords, shields, spears, bows, all S and A rank, the elite. Yuna stood at the front, a sword at her belt, that very one, reforged by Dan. She looked at him, nodded. Dan nodded back. He carried his black bone sword on his back. A pouch with 12 bolts hung from his belt. A first aid kit from Becky lay in his pocket. They went inside. The dungeon was different. Not like a standard B rank. The walls pulsed. A purple light flickered erratically, ragged, like a sick person's breath. The air smelled sour, a familiar smell. Dan stopped. He closed his eyes. He inhaled. The other side, his desert, that very scent of sour stone he'd been breathing in for 100 years. It was here, in Seoul, in a B-rank dungeon. That meant the boundary was thinner than he'd thought. They passed through 3 levels without resistance. On the 4th, they were waiting for them. 5 shapeless ones, black, fluid, no eyes, no mouths, no form, just moving chunks of darkness. The silver tiger hunters attacked. Swords passed through the shapeless ones as if through smoke. Mana arrows scattered. Yuna's icy spears froze in midair and fell to the floor. Nothing worked. Panic. Dan saw it begin. Dilated eyes, rapid breathing, a step back. He stepped forward. Took a bolt from his pouch. One, small, black, threw it. The bolt pierced the nearest shapeless one, and the creature howled. The sound was inaudible. It went through the bones, through the teeth, through the spine. The creature trembled and crumbled. Black dust settled on the floor. Silence. 11 hunters looked at Dan. Dan took out 4 more bolts. He handed them to the 4 closest to him. He explained, "Throw at the center of the mass, hard, quickly. Don't wait for the creature to get close." They threw. 4 shapeless blobs crumbled. Dan looked at Yuna. Yuna stood motionless. Her face was calm, but frost covered the entire floor around her for 2 meters. She was furious. At herself, at her weapon, which had proven useless, at her S rank, which meant nothing mean against these creatures. Dan walked over to her. He spoke quietly so the others wouldn't hear. Her sword isn't useless. She needs to stop striking with mana and start striking with steel, with the bone inside the steel. With that drop of black powder he added during forging, she has to remove the ice, remove the mana, strike with a bare blade. Yuna looked at him, then at her sword. Then she gripped the hilt and struck. Without mana, without ice, just steel with a drop of the other world inside. The blade cut through the air. Nothing happened, because the creatures were gone. But Dan saw that she understood. She nodded. They went deeper. On the 6th level, there were 10 shapeless ones. On the 8th, 20. On the 10th, Dan stopped counting. The bolts ran out on the 9th. Dan pulled out his sword. Black bone, 90 centimeters, a serrated blade. He stepped forward and began doing what he'd been doing for 100 years. Killing. A creature on the left. A strike. Dust. A creature on the right. A strike. Dust. 2 from above, a leap, 2 strikes in midair, dust, 3 from behind, a spin, a horizontal swing, dust. He moved so fast that the 11 S and A rank hunters of the Silver Tiger saw only the result, only the black dust settling on the floor. Yuna stood behind him, watching, at his movements, at his legs, at his arms, at the way he breathed, steady, calm, as if drinking coffee, not as if killing. At the bottom of the dungeon, they found a core, not an ordinary one. Ordinary dungeon cores were blue or purple. This one was black. It pulsed. Dan approached it. He knelt down. He placed his palm on its surface. He closed his eyes, and he felt it. His desert, stony, gray, endless. It was here, on the other side of this core, his pocket, his prison for 100 years. It hadn't disappeared when he left. It had clung to him like a shadow. And now, through it, the other side flowed onto earth. Through him, he opened his eyes. He looked at Yuna, said he needed to tell her something. Everyone, but her first. Because she'd asked the right question on the balcony when the railing was covered in frost. She'd asked what he remembered, and he'd lied then. He remembered everything. He told her on the roof of the workshop building. At night, after the raid, Seoul lay below like a map of light. Millions of lights, millions of lives. 3 violet flickers of the gates on the horizon. Yuna stood at the edge of the roof. The wind ruffled her hair. There was no frost. She was in control of herself. Dan sat on a concrete ledge and spoke. He told her about the pocket, about 100 years, about the creatures that came every day, about how he forged from bones and brewed from blood, about how he counted the days with scratches on the rock and lost track in the 34th year, about how he was forgetting Korean and talking to himself to remember. Yuna already knew all this from the association's reports, but then came what no one knew. In the 40th year, she appeared, a creature, or a woman, or both. Dan hadn't seen her face, he never had. She came out of the fog, she sat down beside him. She spoke in Korean, she fed him something warm and soft. In the desert, where there was nothing warm or soft, she brought food from somewhere. She healed his wounds. When the creature tore at his side or broke his ribs, she laid her hands on them and the pain would go away. She sang, every night, the same lullaby, an old Korean one. He didn't remember the words, only the melody. She was with him for 40 years, from 40 to 80. Then she said it was time for him to go, that the door would open, but not for long, and that someone needed to hold it open from the other side. Dan understood. He said no. She said it wasn't up for discussion. He said he wouldn't leave without her. She said he would leave, because there, on Earth, he had a reason to live. And here, all that was left for him was to die. Not today, not tomorrow, but in 10 or 20 years, there would be too many of them, and he wouldn't be able to handle it. She pushed him out. He didn't get a chance to see her face. He fell through the black void, and the last thing he heard was her voice. Find me there. I'll come to you when I can. Then 20 years of loneliness, again, without her. There were more creatures. They had grown stronger, but he had grown stronger too, because he was angry, because he wanted to get out, because they had promised him. In the 100th year, the door opened again, by itself, or someone opened it. He stepped through it and found himself on the concrete in Incheon, with a sword on his shoulder and no face in his memory. Yuna listened. She didn't move. She didn't interrupt. The wind had died down. There was still no frost. She was in control. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she asked why he had told her this. Dan said he didn't know. Maybe because she was the only one who hadn't tried to get something from him. A contract, an article, an interview. She had come with an offer and left when he said no. And then she sent the sword. Not as a bribe, as a sign of trust. He understood that. Yuna turned to him. Her face was impassive, calm, like ice, but her eyes were different. There was something in them he couldn't name. She said he wasn't alone, that this dungeon in Gangnam was the first but not the last, that over the past month, 2 more dungeons had shown the same symptoms: rotten walls, shapeless insides, black cores. The association is hiding the scale because it fears panic, but Yuna had seen the reports. The boundaries are crumbling, and not just in Korea, Tokyo, Los Angeles, New York, everywhere. Dan nodded. He knew. His pocket wasn't the only one. The fabric was tearing at the seams, and the S+ rift the guilds were whispering about wasn't a rumor. It was inevitable. Yuna asked what to do. Dan said he needed people, not fighters. There are thousands of fighters in the world. He needed people he trusted, who wouldn't sell out the information, who wouldn't run, who wouldn't betray him. He needed a team. Yuna was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said she was with him. Dan looked at her. He asked if she was sure. This meant going against the guilds, against the association, against everyone who wants to sweep the problem under the rug. Yuna said she was sure. Then she added that more people would be coming to him in the next few days. She knows about Ha Min-soo, an S rank from the Scarlet Phoenix, specializing in space. She lost her husband 4 years ago and hasn't taken off her ring since. She's the best tactician in Korea, and she's seen the reports too. Dan asked if she could be trusted. Yuna paused. Then she said that Min-soo was the only person Yuna trusted besides him. Dan nodded. Then they stood on the roof in silence. 2 people who looked out at the city and understood that this city might cease to exist if they didn't do what they had to do. Yuna turned to him. The wind blew again. A strand of hair fell into her eyes. She brushed it away with her hand, as usual. Dan watched. She did this every time, every fight, every training session. A strand would fall. She would brush it away. He remembered. 2 days later, he placed a small object on the anvil, a hairpin, made of the same material as her sword, black steel with a drop of bone from the other side. Slender, simple, beautiful, not as an ornament, as a tool, for a specific strand, for a specific face, for her. He didn't know it was Yuna's birthday. He hadn't asked. He'd simply seen a problem and solved it, as always, as he'd done for 100 years. Saw a crack, fixed it. He left the hairpin on the anvil with a note for her hair, so it wouldn't get in the way during battle. Yuna took the hairpin that evening. Dan didn't see how. He was in the basement working on new bolts. But in the morning, So-gyun told him that Yuna had stood in the workshop for 10 minutes, holding the hairpin. Then she left. And that morning on the news, Seoul's ice princess appeared in public for the first time in 5 years, with her hair pulled up, not in a ponytail, on a black hairpin that gleamed like a blade. Dan didn't understand why that mattered. So-gyun said he'd understand someday. Dan didn't understand why someday and not now. So-gyun smiled, for the first time that day, a small smile, warm, sad. The team got together in a month. Yuna brought Ha Min-soo, tall, elegant, a suit, a wedding ring on her ring finger. She walked into the workshop and took it all in at a glance. The anvil, the bellows, a shelf with a faceless figurine, 4 boxes and a folding chair, people, Dan at the anvil, So-gyung in the corner with a spear, Emily on a box of coffee, Becky at the table with a notebook, Yuna by the wall with a hairpin in her hair. Min-soo said she'd expected something bigger. Yuna said this was the bigger thing. It just looks small. Min-soo sat down on an empty box. She looked at Dan. She said Yuna had told her everything, about Iznanka, about the shapeless ones, about the day that's crumbling. She wants to know the plan. Dan said the plan is simple. Find all the black cores in Korea's rotten dungeons. Destroy them. Slow down the destruction of the border. Buy time, and at the same time, figure out who's behind the dungeons rotting, because it's no accident. Someone is helping the process from this side. Min-soo nodded. Then she asked how much time they had. Dan said he didn't know for sure, based on how quickly the dungeons are rotting, based on how often the shapeless ones appear. A year, maybe a year and a half, until the S+ rift. Min-soo's expression didn't change. She'd been fighting for 15 years. She knew what an unmovable deadline was. She said she was in. Dan asked why. Min-soo looked at her ring, then at Dan. She said her husband had died on a raid 4 years ago, with a government-issued sword, because they'd been saving up for an apartment. If he'd had a decent sword, he would have survived. Ever since then, she'd hated the system where a hunter's life was worth less than a good weapon. Dan makes weapons for 10,000 won. He's the only person who understands that a weapon isn't a commodity, but an extension of the hand. She wants to be with someone like that when the world starts to fall apart. Dan stood up silently. He went down to the basement. He returned 2 hours later. He was holding a sword, not a new one, a reforged one, made from steel he'd bought at the store around the corner. Ordinary construction steel, but passed through his hands, through black bone powder, through a drop of mana. He held out the sword to Min-soo. The hilt was thinner than standard. The blade was sharper, longer. The balance shifted toward the center. Dan had seen how she moved, once, when she walked from the door to the box. 8 steps. That was enough for him. Long legs, wide stride, high center of gravity. She fights at a distance. She needs a sword that cuts through the air, not pierces armor. Min-soo took the sword, made a test swing. The blade whistled, smoothly, clean, like a song. She froze. Then she looked at the blade, ran her finger along it. Then she said quietly that her husband had dreamed of a sword like this. Dan said this wasn't that sword. It was a new one, but if she wanted, he could make a second one, an exact replica of the one her husband had, based on her description, with the same proportions, made of the same materials as the Iznanka, so that it would be with her, as if her husband were nearby. Min-soo was silent for a long time. Then she took the ring off her finger. She looked at it, the wedding ring she hadn't taken off in 4 years. She looked at the scabbard of the new sword. She placed the ring inside the scabbard, where it would lie next to the blade, next to the sword her husband had wanted, but never received. Now he had it. She looked up at Dan, dry eyes, calm, and said one word: "Thank you." Jeannie was the last to arrive. Eugene So, 17 years old, C rank, sassy, tattooed, leather jacket, 2 knives on her belt. She didn't come by invitation. She came because she heard that a workshop in Hongdae repairs weapons for 10,000 won. She kicked the door open as she entered. She saw 6 people, 2 S ranks, 2 A ranks, 1 B rank, and 1 man with a face that had been on every screen in the country 6 months ago. She stopped. She looked at Dan. then at the sign, sew, repair and forging, then at Dan. Then she said they shared the same last name, so-and-so, which meant they were practically relatives. And since they were relatives, he had to buy her dinner. Emily laughed first, then Becky. Even Yuna's lips twitched slightly. Minsu raised an eyebrow. Sojan looked at Ginny and saw herself 3 years ago, young, angry, hungry, lonely. Dan looked at Ginny, at her knives, cheap, D rank. The blades were dull, the handles were wrapped in electrical tape, the knives of a person who couldn't afford proper weapons. At her hands, calluses, cuts, burns, the hands of a person who fights every day. At her eyes, angry, bright, alive, but beneath the anger, something else, familiar too. He'd seen it in the mirror for the first 30 years of the desert, loneliness masquerading as independence. He said he'd fix her knives, for free, because they were family. Ginny blinked, then she laughed, loudly, sharply, like a bark. Then she sat down on the floor because all the benches were taken, and she stayed there. A week later, Dan found out that Ginny lived in an orphanage run by the guild, that in a year she would turn 18 and be kicked out of the system, that she had no home, no family, no place to go back to. He went to the building's landlord, rented a second room, on the 4th floor, next to Sogyun's room, made a bed out of bone plates, a pillow, a lamp. He hung a nameplate on the door, Yujin So, and handed her the key. Ginny took the key. She looked at him, then at the door, then at the nameplate, her name, on the door, her door. She didn't cry. She just stopped talking for 3 days, because every time she opened her mouth, tears came out instead of words. On the 4th day, she silently placed a cup of coffee on the anvil in front of Dan. Dan looked at the coffee, then at Ginny. Ginny shrugged and turned away. The next morning, the coffee was on the anvil again, and the next, and the next. It became their ritual, silent, constant, like the sunrise. The workshop was full. 6 people, 6 women, 1 workshop, 1 blacksmith. Dan sat at the anvil and watched them. At Sogyun, who was sharpening a spear in the corner. At Emily, who was laughing at something on her phone. At Becky, who was mixing powders. At Yoon, who was standing by the door with a hairpin in her hair. At Minsu, who was cleaning a new sword with a ring in its scabbard. At Ginny, who was sitting on the floor and drawing something with a marker on the wall. He looked at them and felt something he hadn't felt in 100 years. Home. Not walls, not a roof, not an address. People. People who made him feel at peace. It was the most terrifying and most beautiful feeling of his life. Over the course of a year, they cleared out 14 rotten dungeons. They destroyed 14 black cores. Every time, Dan forged new bolts from black bone. Every time, he went first. Every time, the girls followed him. Not behind, beside. They were learning. Yuna learned to strike without mana, with pure steel and a drop of the other world. Her strikes became 30% faster. Minsu learned to sense rifts in space and seal them before the shapeless ones could crawl out. Emily found a way to shoot arrows with black bone tips. The tremor no longer interfered. The bracelet worked. Becky created an antidote to the shapeless one's toxins based on Dan's methods. 3 hunters from other guilds survived thanks to this antidote. Sogyun rose from B to A rank. Her spear, reforged by Dan twice, was now one of the strongest in Korea. Ginny rose from C to B rank. Her black bone knives became an extension of her hands. She moved so fast that even Yuna sometimes lost sight of her. The workshop had changed. The basement became a forge. The 1st floor remained. The 2nd floor, which Dan had rented for a 3rd month, became Becky's lab. The 3rd floor became a communal kitchen and dining room. The 4th floor became living quarters. Sogyun, Ginny, sometimes Emily when she stayed up late. Dan still lived in the studio apartment 2 blocks away. He still slept on the floor by the wall, but now he fell asleep in 5 minutes, and he woke up to the smell of coffee that Ginny brewed at 6 in the morning and brought him across 2 blocks. Every day, like the sunrise. They weren't a guild. They didn't have a license. There was no contract with the association. They had no name. When journalists asked, Emily replied that they were the workshop, just the workshop. The 9th Circuit found them in the 8th month. Dan learned about the 9th Circuit from Becky. She hadn't completely severed ties with the American agency yet and received the file through old channels. A shadow organization, elite hunters, politicians, industrialists. They knew about the S+ rift. They knew before anyone else, and they decided that humanity wouldn't survive the battle. Their plan was different, to negotiate negotiate, to open the rift on their own terms, to let in whatever was on the other side, and secure a place in the new world. Im Tae-hoon was at the head of Contour, Deputy Minister of Defense, S+ rank, the only one on the planet. He came to the workshop in person, without security, without weapons, in a regular suit. He sat on a box that had once been empty and was now called Emily's box. He looked at Dan, smiled, said he'd wanted to meet him for a long time. Dan stood behind the anvil, hammer in hand. He recognized Tae-hoon, not by his face, by his energy, dark, deep, like a black core at the bottom of a dungeon, like the other side. Tae-hoon offered him a place. The first place, next to him. When the rift opens and the world changes, Dan will be the bridge between the sides. A man who has lived on the other side for 100 years. The perfect mediator. Dan listened, then he said no. Tae-hoon wasn't surprised. He said he'd expected it, but he wanted to try, because the next step would be unpleasant. He stood up, walked to the door, turned around at the door, said he knew about Sogyun, about her brother, about the room on the 4th floor, about the nameplate. Dan clenched the hammer. Tae-hoon smiled. He said that a bridge between worlds is beautiful, but an anchor is even more beautiful. An anchor that keeps a person in place. Break the anchor, and the bridge will collapse on its own. He left. Dan stood and stared at the closed door, the hammer in his hand, the anvil before him, and for the first time in 127 years, he felt fear. Not for himself, for them. In the 12th month, Tae-hoon struck. Not at Dan, at Sogyun. His men intercepted her on her way back from a raid. 3 A-rank hunters. She fought back. The spear reforged by Dan held up against their blows, but there were 3 of them, and she was alone. They didn't kill her. They took her away. Dan found out an hour later. Ginny ran into the workshop barefoot, phone in hand. Her voice was breaking. She said So-gyung hadn't returned, that her phone wasn't answering, that at the spot where she was supposed to be, they'd found traces of a struggle and the broken hairpin that So-gyung had been wearing ever since Yuna gave her her old one. The workshop fell silent. Emily turned pale. Becky grabbed the first aid kit. Min-soo closed her eyes and began scanning the space. Yuna stood motionless. The floor around her was covered in frost within a 3-meter radius. Dan placed the hammer on the anvil, quietly, carefully, as if the hammer were alive and might be frightened. Then he took the black bone sword from the wall, that very one. 100 years old, 90 centimeters, serrated. Min-soo opened her eyes. She said she'd found it, the roof of the Scarlet Phoenix headquarters. 40 stories, protective barriers on every level, at least 20 hunters inside. Dan nodded, said he'd go alone. Yuna said no. All 6 voices at once. No. He looked at them, at Yuna with frost on the floor, at Emily with a bracelet on her wrist and a bow on her back, at Becky with a first aid kit and steely eyes, at Min-soo with a sword and a ring in its scabbard, at Jeannie with 2 knives and bare feet. He wanted to say it was dangerous, that Tae-hoon was S+ rank, that they could get killed, but he looked at their faces and realized it was useless to speak. They wouldn't leave. He nodded. They left the workshop, all 6 of them, and him. 7 people against the 9th contour. The roof of the Scarlet Phoenix headquarters. Night. Wind. Seoul lay below, 40 stories of light. Tae-hoon stood at the edge. Behind him, 12 contour hunters, A and S rank, the best of the best. So-gyung stood next to Tae-hoon. He held her by the shoulder. She was unharmed, pale, eyes red, but unharmed. Dan stepped forward. His team lined up behind him, in a semicircle. Yuna on the left, sword at the ready. Min-soo on the right, hands glowing with spatial mana. Emily in the back, arrow on the string. Becky next to her, bubbles in her hands. Ginny on the flank, 2 knives, barefoot. Tae-hoon looked at them, then at Dan. Then he smiled. He said it was beautiful. 7 against the world, but pointless. He moved So-gyung closer to the edge, 40 floors to the asphalt. So-gyung didn't resist. She looked at Dan, only at him. Tae-hoon said, "Come to me and she'll live. You have 5 seconds." Dan looked at So-gyung, at her small face, at the dark circles under her eyes, at her slender wrists, at the hands that had held a spear for 3 years to feed her brother, at the hands that brought him rice balls every morning. So-gyung looked at him and whispered with her lips alone so no one would hear, "Don't. I'm not worth it." The world stopped. Sound vanished. The wind froze. Soul below went dark. Because Dan heard, not the words, the intonation. 3 syllables, soft, quiet, with a slight tremor on the last sound. He had heard that intonation every night for 40 years, in a stone desert, when someone invisible laid hands on his wounds and sang a lullaby, when someone told him he had to live, that he deserved it, that he was worth it. In that same voice, with the same intonation, the same 3 syllables on the exhale. It's her, So-gyeon, a 19-year-old girl with a spear and rice balls. It was she who sang him a lullaby 100 years ago, or 100 years from now. Time in the other side does not obey Earth's laws. The soul that saved him had not yet been born back then, but it was born now and stood before him at the edge of the 40th floor. Dan smiled, for the first time in 127 years, truly, not with his lips, with his whole face, with his eyes, with the wrinkles around his eyes that a 27-year-old shouldn't have, but which a 127-year-old has. He spoke softly, so softly that only she could hear. You stand. You have always stood. So-gyeon froze. Her eyes widened. Something flashed in them. Not recognition, not memory. Something deeper, like the echo of a song she had never sung but knew by heart. Dan took a step forward. Tae-hoon said time was up. Dan took a second step. By the third step, he was right next to Tae-hoon. Not because he'd sped up, not because he used a skill, because 100 years of muscle memory isn't speed, it's inevitability. Tae-hoon struck. S+ rank, the strongest man on the planet. His fist carried so much energy that the air around it compressed and burst. Dan took the blow on his left arm. His arm cracked. It broke in 2 places. He didn't notice. With his right arm, he grabbed So-gyeon, pulled her toward him, pushed her back. Min-soo caught her with a spatial shield and pulled her back to the team. Dan stood before Tae-hoon with a broken arm and a sword in his right hand. Tae-hoon looked at him, for the first time, without a smile. He said that Dan had just signed the death warrant for the entire world, that without him as the S+ key, the rift would open uncontrollably, that millions would die. Dan said he would find another way. Tae-hoon asked what it was. Dan said he didn't know, but he would find one, because he had spent 100 years searching for a way out of the stone desert, and had found it. And here, he had something he hadn't had in the desert. Tae-hoon asked what. Dan looked back, at his team, at the 6 women standing with their weapons at the ready, not about to leave. Then he said one word, people. The fight was short. 12 contour hunters against 6 women and 1 blacksmith with a broken arm. Yuna froze 4 of them within the first 3 seconds. Min-soo warped the space around 3 more, trapping them in loops they couldn't escape. Emily took down 2 with arrows tipped with black bone. Becky tossed a vial of paralyzing potion at the 5th man's feet. Ginny slipped between the 6th and 7th like a shadow, and both fell without understanding what had happened. Tae-hoon stood alone. 12 of his men lay on the roof. He looked at Dan, then at his team. Then he said this wasn't the end, that the rift would open, that Dan was the key, and you couldn't escape the key. Then he vanished. A spatial jump, S+ rank. Even Min-soo couldn't track him. Dan stood on the roof. His left arm hung limply by his side, broken, a sword in his right. The wind. Soul below. Lights. Life. So-gyeon stood beside him, alive, unharmed. She looked at him. He looked at her. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she began to hum softly. A melody. An old one. A Korean one. A lullaby. She didn't know where she knew this melody from. She had never heard it before, but she knew it, just as one knows how to breathe. Dan listened. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't wipe them away. On the roof of the 40th floor in the center of Seoul, a blacksmith with a broken arm and a girl with a spear stood side by side, one singing and the other listening. And standing around them were 5 women who were their home. Ahead lay the S+ rift. Ahead lay Tae-hoon. Ahead lay a war for which humanity was not ready. But Dan looked at So-gyeon and did not think of the rift. He thought that he needed to cook myeongguk soup tomorrow, because tomorrow was So-gyeon's birthday. She herself had forgotten, but he remembered. He always remembered. 100 years, and another 27, and as many more as it takes. The workshop is open. The door is open. So, repairs and blacksmithing. Come on in.